بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له أن محمدا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم من يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري وأحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي أما بعد. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, my dear brothers and sisters, we are here once again to reflect on the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And today we will talk about the name As-Saboor, the patient. And after today, we will have completed this series talking about the 99 names of Allah. And before I get into the khutbah, I want to remind myself and then all of you listening that the conclusion of this khutbah series should not be seen as a moment of joy or celebration. You must be wondering, why would I say such a thing that this is not a moment of joy? Because the conclusion of anything marks the end of a journey, and the ends of a journey are a moment to celebrate. I say this because learning about the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only the start of our journey. To seek closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is our journey. This is a journey that is perpetual. Until we are no longer in this world, these attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are there to help us begin to understand the nature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is there to help us to start making changes in ourselves and our actions. And perfection belongs to only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for us, we have a constant struggle to achieve perfection. And struggle might seem like a strong word to you for us to use here because it implies notable difficulty. However, I want to encourage you to think about the word struggle as a range. So there's a range of difficulties from easy to challenging. And we constantly struggle to become better versions of ourselves, and we strive continuously to become better versions of ourselves. And we see this constant struggle not just in our own personal lives, but we also see this in the lives of others. So to be a practicing Muslim is to accept struggle as part of our lives. So let's talk about struggle in our daily lives. And there are many demands in our time from our work, from our co-workers, and all of these moments steal time away from what we want to spend most, which might be the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And think about how many times you found yourselves on the road where maybe you're heading to meet a client, maybe you're heading home after a long day of work, and then it's time for salah. And if you're on the road, you might think to yourself, okay, I'm going to miss this salah because of traffic or because of the distance that you have to drive. Or think about the times when you are in back-to-back meetings and it's time for salah, but you're uncomfortable in that moment being that one person who's going to interrupt the meeting or the flow of the meeting to say, I have to leave and I'll come back later. And then there are emotions and egos, remembering that our spirit lives inside a physical form, and our physical form has emotions and ego among many other qualities. And these emotions and our ego collaborate to steal moments away from us that we would have liked to spend in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So think about the times when you woke up for Fajr. You're in the warmth and the comfort of your bed. That might feel more appealing to you than getting out of bed to perform the Fajr Salah. That is our physical form, our ego wanting to control us, or our emotions wanting to control us. Or in the winter months when you wake up for Fajr, and it might be cold outside, might be cold inside your home, but you do know that the moment you turn that tap on, that cold water that you wash your hands and face with, it might hurt. Yet, despite the comfort of your bed, yet despite the cold water, you still struggle against your nafs. You still struggle to get out of bed. You make that wudu, you perform that obligatory Fajr Salah. And when these things happen to us, there are some days when we might think to ourselves, is our iman really so weak that we are constantly fighting our egos, we're constantly fighting our emotions? We wonder if we struggle because our hearts have not yet turned towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we wonder if we are not a good Muslim because we are constantly struggling to follow the rules set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is in these times when we are concerned and fighting our nature, struggling against our nature, that we should remind ourselves that our iman is strong precisely because we have that concern. And it is in these times that we should remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ar-Rahim and Al-Adl. Ar-Rahim is the one who acts with extreme kindness, and Al-Adl is the just, the most just in the case of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah knows that humankind is in constant struggle. And Allah reminds us about this. And Allah reminds us that Allah is As-Saboor, the most patient with us. And we are told in Surah Al-Ankabut, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهِدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. As for those who struggle in our cause, we will surely guide them along our way. And in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word jahadu, which has the root of jim, hadal, or juhad. And juhad means to struggle in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the one who struggles is called mujahid. And in this particular verse, Allah is using the word jahidu as a general word to explain struggle. And there's an authentic hadith narrated by Fadila bin Ubaid that the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Mujahidu min jahada nafsahu. The Mujahid is one who strives against his own nafs. So from the Prophet ﷺ, we learn that struggles will come to us, and struggles will come to us in many forms because our nafs, our ego, is part of our nature. And we will struggle whether we are a son or a daughter, a husband or a wife, a father or a mother, a student or a professional, and so on. Yet, despite the struggles we run into, the constant for us should be to strive for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is As-Saboor, the most patient. When we think of the word patient in terms of this world, it should invoke fear in us. And you might think, why fear? Because patience eventually runs out. So if our father or our mother comes to us and tells us that they're tired of telling us repeatedly, we know their patience is running thin. And we know that when their patience runs out, there's a consequence. And the same is true if we're at work and our boss tells us that, hey, my patience is running out, waiting for something to be done here. We know that there's a consequence when the boss's patience runs out. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most patient. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is As-Saboor. Think about the story of Iblis from the Quran. Iblis was from among the jinn, and he was from among the believing servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The reward for Iblis was that he was brought into the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just like the angels. This was not a case where Iblis was dreaming. He wasn't having a vision that he was in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Jannah. He was actually in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a reward for his obedience. So when we analyze the story of Iblis, we learn that we are tested with good and we are tested with bad in our lives. Both the good and the bad reveal our true nature. It shows us who we really are. If we have tremendous wealth, for example, and we spend that wealth on alcohol and gambling, it tells us that we love to indulge in the forbidden or what's called haram. And if we choose to give our wealth away because we know that what we have is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and it will help someone else because we have enough of it, it tells us that we are selfless and grateful. And similarly, when we are faced with danger and there are others whose lives are also in danger, yet we choose to save others despite the danger, this tells us that we are brave and willing to sacrifice. And if we choose to run away and save ourselves despite having the opportunity to save others, it tells us we care more about our personal welfare than that of others. And Iblis was given a similar opportunity. He was rewarded for his worship by being invited to Jannah and being in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when Allah asked him to prostrate to Adam alayhi salam, Iblis had an important choice to make right in front of him. In that moment, he was given a very important choice. So when Allah asked the angels to prostrate to Adam alayhi salam, the angels prostrated because the angels always obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what does Iblis do? He allows his ego to prevail. He tells Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he will not bow to Adam alayhi salam because Adam alayhi salam was made from clay and he was made from smoke and fire. So in his mind, in his eyes, he was a superior creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the arrogance of Iblis got the better of him. But let's think about the choice that Iblis had when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked him to bow in front of Adam alayhi salam or prostrate to Adam alayhi salam. Adam was going to be appointed the first prophet on earth. So remember, the jinn follow the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this earth. And by asking Iblis to prostrate to Adam alayhi salam, he would have become the first companion to the first prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How great of an honor would that be to be the first companion of the first prophet? Iblis had a front row seat. And what does he do instead? He chooses to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now imagine your boss tells you to do something and you say no. Your boss is not asking you to do something unreasonable or illegal. Let's just assume it's good and you refuse. How do you think your boss might react? Let's forget about boss. Let's say your mom asks or parents asked for something. How would they react if you said, no, I'm not going to do this? Your boss might probably fire you after throwing a little bit of anger around. Your parents might not be happy with you. They might yell at you. Now imagine Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asking Iblis, a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Iblis telling Allah that he's not going to obey. Imagine telling your creator, no, I am not going to do what you tell me. So does Allah have the right to be angry in that moment? From our perspective, from our human perspective, absolutely, we would say, yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have been angry. But was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala surprised by the actions of Iblis? Not at all. Why? Because Allah knows the nature of His creations. Nothing is hidden from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He tested Iblis with a choice to reveal the nature of Iblis. And every test that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us, whether it's good or bad, is an opportunity for us to reveal our true nature. So the invitation to Jannah for Iblis marked the beginning of Iblis's test for his obedience. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewarded Iblis for his worship by inviting him to Jannah. Then told him to bow down to Adam, and instead he chooses to rebel. So much for obedience. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposed his true nature in that moment. And Allah could have immediately punished Iblis. What does Allah do instead? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala patiently waits until the day of judgment. And similarly, in the Quran, we learn from the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, or Joseph in English. All of us listening likely know this story quite well. It is one of the most descriptive stories in the Quran and one of the most complete stories in the Quran. And we learn about patience from the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. Yusuf had to demonstrate patience when he was wrongfully sent to prison for an act he didn't commit. And Yusuf was sold as a slave to a powerful man in Egypt who also had authority in the government. And the wife of this powerful man was attracted to Yusuf alayhi salam because of his beautiful features. So imagine one of the most powerful women in your community throwing themselves at you. What would you do in that situation? Yusuf alayhi salam chose to show restraint and God consciousness. From Surah Yusuf, we learned that Ma'azallahi, innahu rabbi ahsanu mathwa, innahu la yuflihu zalimun. Allah is my refuge. So Yusuf alayhi salam says, Allah is my refuge. It is not right to betray my master who has taken good care of me. Indeed, the wrongdoers never succeed. So this is at the point where the lady of the house is wanting to come after Yusuf alayhi salam and he refuses. Yusuf alayhi salam shows fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and does not want to test the patience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how does Yusuf alayhi salam know to avoid fornication outside of marriage? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this to Yusuf alayhi salam. And we know this because in the same chapter, Surah Yusuf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَلَقَدْ حَمَّتْ بِهِ وَحَمَّ bihalo wahamma bihalo la arra'a arra'abru abruhana rabbihi ولقد همت به وهم بها لولا أن رأى برهان ربه. She advanced towards him, and he would have done likewise had he not seen the sign from his Lord. So, this verse in Surah Yusuf is giving us guidance through the story of Yusuf alayhi salam to avoid that which is forbidden. And in this instance, it's fornication outside of marriage. And despite his best efforts, Yusuf alayhi salam is set up by this woman and he's sent to prison. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of Yusuf alayhi salam. If we're sent to prison for something that we did not do, how would we feel? We would probably feel angry. We would probably feel frustration. We would probably feel depressed at our situation. But how does Yusuf alayhi salam handle it? He could have felt all of these emotions as well, but how does he choose to act instead? Yusuf alayhi salam, instead of cursing, instead of, saying bad things about his brothers who were the reason for him to be there in the first place, and who, because of them, was sold into slavery, and consequently, he finds himself in all this trouble with the government. What does Yusuf alayhi salam do instead? For the years that he spent in prison, he decides that he's going to spread the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, that's not the only thing. Yusuf alayhi salam was also given the gifts of interpreting dreams, and he uses that gift in prison by translating dreams, and that eventually leads to his release from prison. So he put this gift to work, he spreads the message of Allah, and he focuses on all the benefits and gratitude that comes along with being in such a difficult position. And that is what he chooses to do. So he's finally relieved after many years in prison, and he's rewarded with a position of power in the government. So he becomes a regent who is responsible for taking care of the distribution of grains. And in that time, there's a moment when his brothers come to town and he sees them. And as a regent, a person with power, he could have easily punished them or have them arrested. But what does he do instead? He's now a prominent leader in Egypt. And instead of punishing them, he chooses to demonstrate kindness and generosity. He chose to show them a better character than they demonstrated to him. So, my dear brothers and sisters, to struggle is to have patience and gratitude. Patience with ourselves and others, and gratitude for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we're given wealth, when we're given power, or when we're given authority, we should exercise patience. With wealth, patience comes in the form of restraint from spending on things that are not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or spending on that which is forbidden, or as we call haram. And with power and authority, it's knowing that our ability to be just can be compromised by our emotions. So, to avoid making regrettable decisions, being patient with us and letting our emotions flow over before we act becomes very, very important. Imagine if you had a bad day and you went ahead and did something with the power that you used and regret it the next day. And that is why it's important for us, when we do have power and authority, to be very careful about how we act and behave, especially when we're driven by emotions. What about when we're faced with calamity or hardship or poverty? We should exercise gratitude in those cases, because when calamity or hardship touches us, our actions is to find refuge and escape from the calamity or the hardship. Anything to take the calamity or hardship away. While finding solace away from hardship is important, it's also important for us to be grateful, because our present circumstance could always be worse than what they are. And we see this all around us today. So many conflicts, so many troubles for the Muslim Ummah. Our hearts cry and bleed out. But still, we must always remember that there is a lesson, there is a plan that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in all of this that troubles us today. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, La yukallifullahu nafsan illa was'aha. Allah does not burden any soul with more than it can bear. So while we bear the troubles that we have personally, there are times when we also struggle with the hardships that our Muslim brothers and sisters face. And that is a sign of compassion. That is a sign of strength that we all possess. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never burden us with more than what we're able to withstand. And when we're struck with hardship personally, it might feel like it is too much to bear. However, the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is true. And we should remember that any test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, good or bad, reveals our true nature. So if we bow down to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or if we raise our hands up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and show our gratitude, that is our true nature. Similarly, with poverty, it is easy to feel jealous if others have more than us. However, reminding ourselves that this too is a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is a test of our nature, and it will eventually reveal who we are and it will eventually pass. So, do we allow the worst of our nature to prevail, or do we allow the best of our nature to prevail? And that is the question we have in front of us. So, the people who practice patience are called sabirin. And the word sabr means patience. So, for example, an athlete who practices discipline knows that the difference between them and the best in their sport is the one who practices despite their struggles, despite the day when they wake up in the morning and say, today is not the day I'm going to practice. That is the difference between the best and the one who is not. And the reward for the athlete who puts in the practice and the hard work is recognition and accolades in their sport. And as Muslims, our struggle is to remain in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to find that discipline every day to practice our faith, despite the changing of the seasons or the attitudes of the people in this world. How do we consistently stay disciplined? And for this struggle, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises great rewards that are better than anything this world can offer to us. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevate our understanding of the Quran and increase us in knowledge, inshallah, and give us wisdom that gives us the ability to apply this knowledge when we need it most. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My dear brothers and sisters, as with every attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we try and learn lessons from it so that we can apply it on our own lives. So how do we learn? What do we learn from the attribute As-Saboor? We learn that we should be patient when we falter or when others around us falter. Being a follower of Islam, we learn to be patient. It is part of our creed. We learn to abstain from that which is forbidden or haram and only act on those things which is permissible or halal. And when we make a mistake, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forbearance. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Halim, the clement one. So through hilm or forbearance, we seek the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if Allah punished every creation when it makes a mistake or transgresses, then there would be no creation left on this earth or the universe. As soon as we made a mistake, we would receive immediate punishment. Think about the story of Iblis. In front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Iblis disobeyed. And if Allah wanted to destroy Iblis in that moment, Allah could have done so immediately. That is not a challenge for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, with every story from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we learn in the Quran, there is a lesson for us. And through the story of Iblis, we learn about patience and obedience. The angels obeyed while Iblis disobeyed. And Iblis had a wonderful, honorable choice to make, but he chose not to make that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is As-Saboor. He, Jalla Jalaluhu, tests our true nature. But He does not need shaitan to test our true nature. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows our true nature, and by testing us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is allowing us to compete with one another, not through direct competition, but through acts of obedience and kindness. And if Allah displays patience with those who transgress, even with those who transgress against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is how we should strive to live our own lives. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us with pious spouses and offsprings who will be the joy of our hearts. And I ask Allah to give us guidance, to keep us on the straight path, and to lead us all to Jannatul Firdaus. I ask Allah to forgive our sins, absolve us of our misdeeds, and allow us each to die as one of the virtuous. I ask Allah to forgive us, our parents, and the believers on the day when the judgment will come to pass. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the will to learn and the will to implement our lives in the way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ربنا هب لنا من ازواجنا وذرياتنا قرة اعين واجعلنا للمتقين اماما ربنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الابرار ربي اجعلني ربي اجعلني مقيم الصلاة ومن ذرياتي ربنا وتقبل دعاء ربنا اغفر لي ولوالدي وللمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب ربنا آمنا فاغفر لنا وارحمنا وأنت خير الراحمين إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين آمين اللهم آمين